All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for being here with us. I'm Maria Herreras, and I'm the publicity manager for the University of Arizona Press. Welcome to our event, Community Histories, Activist Histories in San Jose and Sacramento, California. On behalf of the University of Arizona Press, I want to thank our authors, Lorena Márquez and Josie Méndez-Negrete, for generously sharing their time with us this afternoon. The University of Arizona Press is the premier publisher of academic, regional, and literary works in the state of Arizona. We disseminate ideas and knowledge of lasting value that enrich understanding, inspire curiosity, and enlighten readers. We advance the University of Arizona's mission by connecting scholarship and creative expression to readers worldwide. Founded in 1959, the Press is a nonprofit publisher of scholarly and regional books. We publish about 55 books annually and have more than 1,600 books in print. These include scholarly titles in anthropology, archaeology, environmental science, history, indigenous studies, Latinx studies, Latin American studies, and the space sciences, as well as award-winning fiction and poetry in our series Sun Tracks and Camino del Sol. Activist leaders of San Jose and sus propias voces documents and records the stories of those who made contributions to the cultural and civic life of San Jose. Through interview, excerpts, biographical and historical information and analysis, Méndez-Negrete shows the contributions of the singular community throughout the 20th century and the diversity. I'm so sorry about that, y'all. This is going to be my struggles with Zoom. Méndez-Negrete shows the contributions of this singular community throughout the 20th century and the diversity of motivations across the generations. In Gente, struggles for empowerment and community self-determination in Sacramento, Marquez shows that the Chicano movement was not solely limited to a handful of organizations or charismatic leaders. Rather, it encouraged those that were the most marginalized, the working poor, immigrants, and/or the undocumented and the undereducated, to fight for their rights on the premise that they too were contributing and deserving members of society. It's my pleasure to introduce these authors today. Josie Méndez-Negrete is a professor emerita of Mexican American Studies in the Department of Bilingual Bicultural Studies, the Mexican American Studies program, and the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Texas at San Antonio. She is the author of two previous books, A Life on Hold, Living with Schizophrenia, takes us inside the heartbreak of mental illness. La Hijas de Juan, Daughters Betrayed, narrates a story of domestic and sexual violence in her family. Born in Lodi, California, to Mexican immigrant farm workers and raised in nearby Galt, Lorena Marquez has never forgotten her roots. In fact, as the fourth of 7 children and only one to attend college, she credits her humble upbringing to help fuel her drive to pursue her educational goals. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Chicana Studies at the University of California, Davis. It's my pleasure to welcome them, and I thank them so much for their time today. And on behalf of the University of Arizona Press, we thank you too for joining us today. We're going to start the program with Josie, who's going to talk about her work and her book. And then Lorena will be next and do the same. Thank you so much, Josie.
Thank you. To all my relations, to the University of Arizona Press, thank you. To Maria Herreras, I extend my appreciation for moderating this talk. This book has been my dream come true. It documents the lives of Chicana and Latino Chicano activist leaders of San Jose, California. It truly is a dream come true. When I see your amazing faces, I'm back. in the place that I still call home. I'll begin by talking a little bit about the people whom I've studied. And I was able to do so as a result of their generosity and their willingness to contribute to the creation of knowledge for our community, given that regardless of education, they all understood that without us telling our stories, they never enter the page and they never get documented. Among those of the Depression generation who left us are Jose Villa, whose life work focused on educational rights at all levels, who struggled against police violence and who fought for bilingual education. Antonio Soto, who taught many of us to embrace our intellectual and spiritual lives. Esther Medina, Sofia Mendoza, and Ernestina Garcia, strong women who fought for educational, health, and political access in the community. Jack Prito, an education and community activist leader whose work focused on corrections. Of this generation, we still have many amongst us. From this study, V. Vasquez Robinson, Blanca Alvarado, Jose Carrasco, George Castro, Luco Arrubias, and Victor Garza, who in their respective ways continue to work for change. While activist leaders of the baby boomer generation continue their involvement, Cecilia Arroyo, Josie Romero, and Mike Garcia have long departed. With their absence, they left gaps in county planning, county mental health, and democratic policies, as well as in the unionization of service employees and undocumented workers, whether retired or relocated. Delia Alvarez, Rosa Amador, Elisa Alvarado, Kathy Chavez Napoli, Felix Alvarez, Pete Carrillo, and Tony Estremera still do their part in the struggle for social justice and social change. Chicanas of the Depression generation. The migration of Blanca Alvarado's family, the Sanchez's, was precipitated by the closing of the mines in Colorado, forcing the family to move to California with the intent of settling in Los Angeles. Yet not finding Los Angeles to their liking, the family moved north and set up residence in Santa Clara County, where my family was contracted to do agricultural work for a local rancher in San Jose. Ernestina Garcia, whose parents were born in Mexico, said, "Apa and Ama taught a strong identification with the culture and instilled in us the responsibility of fulfilling civic duties and democratic participation." Garcia said that her father was not an activist. He worked for the ranchers to be able to support all of us with contracts that ended. Le daba la casa, pero tenía que trabajar, se le descontaba, no le daban nada. Attributing the family's migration to the turmoil and poverty of the Mexican Revolution, Garcia spoke about the hardship of working in the fields. On the other hand, Sofia Mendoza's father was an activist. He worked as a union organizer in the mines and in the agricultural fields. According to Mendoza, her father organized a strike of citrus fruit pickers in the biggest ranch in California, and they evicted everybody. After that, the family moved to Santa Clara County, setting up residence in Campbell, where her dad purchased an acre of land. The strike was something that Mendoza and Esther Medina had in common. Medina's father was involved in the strike, and he was also invested in the community, establishing an organization for Fiestas Patrias. Along with a strong commitment to the preservation of Mexican culture, Medina learned from both parents a philosophy of service to the community. V. Vasquez Robinson, whose parents came from Mexico, spoke about traveling across the country in a little old Ford truck, and they settled in Gilroy, a place she recalls as racist and separatist. And in terms of Latinos, you were second class all the way. In her view, in the midst of poverty, work was probably the dominating force. We were expected to work, be productive, and consequently, everyone in my family has a strong work ethic. Latinos Chicanos of the Depression generation. Jack Prito, who was also known as the old man on the hill, because he was the mentor and the sage for many Chicanos back in the day. His father grew up in El Paso and from there moved to Arizona, San Diego, and finally settled in Los Angeles. When Prito was in the 10th grade, the family moved to Santa Clara, where I stopped going to school. When truant officers still chase you, they caught me and made me quit. Out of school, he could not find employment, floating from cannery work to cleaning windows and sweeping floors, but soon enlisted in the army, ending up in Korea. I got out in August of 1947. Jose Carrasco, also a Korean conflict veteran, remembers his growing up years in Santa Clara as difficult. The living conditions were dire for the entire family. I lived in a little chicken shack, and the old landlady herself was kind of eccentric, but her son's family was very distant with us, especially since they certainly had options at the time. Through that experience, Carrasco recognized their economic difference. They had their own home. We had nothing. George Castro migrated to San Jose at the age of 24 in 1968 to take a position at IBM. His family immigrated from Mexico during the time of the Mexican Revolution. Born in the United States, for Castro, poverty was relative. We were not poorer than other Mexicanos, but we were better off. For him, it would not be until they moved near whites that their poverty became obvious. From Irvington, our mission San Jose, Luco Varrubias was brought up by a grandfather who was non-materialistic. They moved from place to place as the grandfather didn't want to buy a home because siempre se quería ir para Mexico. He longed to return to the homeland, an immigrant dream of his day, which came with the notion of making money and returning to live the rest of his days there. When the Leslie Salt Company hired his grandfather, his dream ended and their constant movement ceased. Victor Garza is from Eagle Pass, the home base from which the family followed the migrant stream, going from Texas to the Midwest. He worked in the fields until the age of 26, when I finally realized that wasn't for me, and I moved from Texas to Sanger near Fresno, and we worked there in the fields for a while. He would move to San Jose, where he became involved in educational and political rights. Unlike Garza, Antonio Soto came from an educated family with involved and active parents. Movement for the Soto family was localized to a small area of Arizona. From a very traditional, well-established family that had been there for 100 years, we lived in a community where the family had status. There was no need to migrate or do agricultural work. We were a different type of Mexican. For Jose Villa, the revolution and income insecurity launched the family migration. They settled in Clovis, New Mexico, where they found employment in agriculture, and from there migrated to work in the fields. Villa recalled, "My father couldn't earn enough from just holding a railroad job, so we'd work in los campos de algodón, las escardas, or weeding the crops and pulling broom corn. We did work." In the experience of those in the Depression generation, class and race were structures of inequality that shaped their daily interactions. Dire circumstances, rather than leading them into reproducing poverty, inspired these activist leaders to improve conditions for their people and themselves. Chicanas of the baby boomer generation. Delia Alvarez was born in Salinas, California. Like Soto of the Depression generation, her family owned property and were not employed in agriculture. She was raised in a Noki community, and rather than Mexican barrio, she said, "We lived in the East Side. We were poor, but I didn't know the difference." She would understand poverty when exposed to those who had more. Born in Cupertino, California, Cecilia Arroyo grew up in an area that would become De Anza College, where, except for a few Okies, our neighborhood was all Chicano. Both maternal and paternal relatives lived in the vicinity. 10 years later, when her brother was born, the family relocated to Santa Clara. Josie Romero was born in Texas, where the family followed the Pacific Northwest Migrant Trail for 20 years. Despite the constant interruption of her schooling, Romero dealt with her situation capably. I was in school for 2 or 3 weeks. I loved it. It was easy for me. No me daba vergüenza. I was not ashamed to ask questions or of being the new kid. I was there for a purpose. I did what needed to be done, and at about 14 and 15, it became difficult to keep up, and I quit to go to work. Rose Amador was born in San Jose, and her family readily moved to Pennsylvania, where I pretty much grew up the first 12 years of my life. In a community with minimal diversity, I didn't experience much discrimination and grew up with the same kids from kindergarten all the way through 6th grade. For her, it was a comfortable, secure, and good experience. Elisa Marina Alvarado was born in San Francisco. Her father was the sole support of the family. As a one-income family, frugality was encouraged. We had a sense of what it was like to contribute. We had to help out. If we needed anything else, we would earn the money through babysitting, and we never went out to eat. We struggled. Kathy Chavez Napoli, who was raised in San Jose, traced her ancestry to California. Recalling her growing up experiences, Chavez Napoli said, "I didn't know we were poor and surely didn't know that we lived in Sal Si Puedes until my best friend was taking classes at City College." That's how Chavez Napoli learned the name given to her community. Poverty and movement linked the experiences of these activist leaders. While a few own their homes, most have memories of limited space and having to make do with what they had. Some experienced economic limitations, but most did not recognize poverty until they were exposed to those who had more. Conflict experienced by Chicanas centered more on gender inequality with the intersections of race and class as they navigated their respective communities. Latinos Chicanos of the baby boomer generation. From South Texas, Felix Alvarez came from a large family. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house. One bedroom was for mom and dad and the smaller siblings that grew up literally in their bed. And the other bedroom was for my grandparents. And the rest may do anywhere there was floor space. From an early age, Alvarez learned about the contradictions confronted by Texas Mexicans as he developed the critical consciousness about being. With no immediate ties to Mexico, Pete Carrillo proudly linked his origins to Arizona. At the age of 24, Carrillo temporarily relocated to San Jose. However, when he found a job at the Center for Employment Training, he made San Jose his permanent home and became involved in the community, focusing on politics, employment, and educational rights. Tony Estremera, a self-described Chico Rican, is from Puerto Rico and migrated to New York as a child. As an adolescent in Job Corps, he became the bridge person for his family to move to California via Sal Si Puedes. At 16, Estremera became active in United People Arriba, the Community Alert Patrol, MAXA, and student organizations. Mike Garcia and his parents were born in East Los Angeles. The family moved to San Francisco when there were but a few Mexicans living in the to San Fernando, when there were but a few Mexicans living in the suburb. He recalled, "My first 6 years was all Mexican and Mexicano is still a. There was a war going on. I didn't understand it. It affected my self-image, and I was subjugated to name calling." Jorge Gonzalez was born in Mexico City. He immigrated to the United States with his mother, becoming an urban migrant in Ventura County. Gonzalez later moved to San Diego, where his stepfather obtained his master's degree and introduced Jorge to the movimiento. From there, he became involved in student and workers' rights. Overall, the participants in this study gave various reasons for relocating to various communities. Some moved to counter the effects of poverty, while others were pushed by the Mexican Revolution or as a result of economic need. Among those who participated in the study, most had a strong work ethic and promoted self-sufficiency as a core value, perceiving themselves as not having a choice but to work. Activist leaders of both generations, in their quest to create a better world for their people and for themselves, internalized injuries and traumas of poverty, race, and class, with Chicanas more clearly experiencing gender oppression. The systemic differences in their lived experience became the frame of reference from which to engage their activist leaders' agenda in San Jose, California, as they actively and proactively sought to make a difference and create change. Thank you.
Thank you, Maestra. Very much appreciate that reading. Beautiful. Let's bring on Maestra Marquez to read her excerpt and talk about her book and studies as well.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Josie, for sharing that. I think oral interviews are really powerful. And as a historian, I know I had to rely on interviews to fill in the gaps that the archives couldn't provide, sort of the real experiences of folks. So I know interviews are just instrumental when you are trying to locate those voices. And so my book work is on Sacramento. I focus on the Chicano movement. And I really wanted to talk today or share a little bit of my writing on activism and how we understand activism and how we understand leadership, and also by focusing on gender. So I'm going to read a little bit from my book. In many ways, participating in a movement is a luxury for few working class folks can afford, especially for women who managed most of the household and child rearing duties, and also often worked outside the home to bring in the much necessary additional financial flow to offset expenses. This is not to dismiss the tremendous sacrifices farm workers and their families made during the Great Strike of the mid-1960s under the direction of the United Farm Workers Union, or such undertakings, but these decisions tend to be measured. Engaging in overt forms of resistance requires tremendous sacrifices from the working poor, and when collectively engaging in protest, their demands are all the more powerful and meaningful. My work demonstrates that traditional definitions of activism need further revision and reconsideration. Activism is commonly referred to as a political act or participation in collective action against the powers that be, often exhibited through certain acts such as holding a picket sign, chanting at a rally, signing a petition, speaking out against a wrong in a public forum, participating in a boycott or sit-in, serving in leadership roles in formal organizations or associations, etc. Yet many who partook in the Chicano movement never saw themselves or would claim to be activists, organizers, or leaders, terms often used interchangeably by Chicana movement agents. Instead, some, especially the women I interviewed for this study, perceived their participation as minimal or as supportive of la causa. This point was stressed by Graciela B. Ramirez in a recent interview, and I'm quoting. I'm sorry, I lost my spot here. To have met people like Jose Montoya, Joe Serna, Isabel Hernandez Serna, Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, to be part of something that to me was bigger than life. People who were like me, like the foot soldiers, working all the time. Sometimes I don't like to include myself as a leader because I wasn't that important. Ramirez diminishes her role as a Chicana activist and instead refers to herself as a foot soldier, a term commonly used during the civil rights movement for someone doing the grunt work or the heavy lifting. For her, leaders, organizers took center stage, were visible actors, and were well known inside and out of the Chicana movement circles. A leader was a label she struggled or refused to claim or accept for herself. Likewise, Laura Llano, a Chicana artist and participant in the Sacramento Chicana movement, shared similar sentiments. Llano explained, and I'm quoting, "I would say I was not an organizer because I did not like to sit in all those stupid meetings and hours of fighting. I'm not a fighter, but my friend Manuela and Isabel and other people would be in the thick of it. And my friend Manuela would give me a call and she would say, hey, we need this, and can you make that, or can you do this, or can you do that? I would say I was a soldier. I was a helper. but I was not in a position of a decision maker, and I chose that. End quote. Llano also uses the term soldier as a reference to a foot soldier to self-describe her role in the Chicana movement, rejecting the label. She rejected labeling herself in the same vein as those she's perceived as organizers or leaders. From her perspective, she served a minimal role as a helper, someone who was always willing and able to do the grunt work for the movement. It could also be argued that both Ramirez and Llano were activist leaders, organizers in some respect, and that their hesitation to include themselves at the same level of leadership as some of their colleagues may derive from gender norms ascribed to them during this era, or from their own limited interpretations of the terms activist, leader, or organizer. Activism, then, must be understood as fluid and not a fixed category to which an individual ascribes. Rather, activism is a collective action taken to challenge or oppose oppressive structures from the bottom up. Activism is not measurable against perceived notions of leadership. It is simply an act or acts of defiance, a manifestation of resistance. It is neither constant nor linear. Activism can be dormant at times, and it can resurge at later life junctures. Activism is not a sole act of expression. It is demonstrated through multiple formats. Thus, during the Chicana movement, activism was present throughout the work of foot soldiers, even if the act itself was deemed insignificant or downplayed by the participants themselves. In some respect, then, foot soldiers and la gente are synonymous. They represent the masses who risked so much and gained so little in return, who showed up, who worked, who made multiple sacrifices for a collective good. Foot soldiers, like la gente, were activists in the makings and makers of social change. They represent the best of the civil rights movement, and their stories matter equally to the well-known leaders of that era. Because they worked selflessly, they did not seek recognition or praise, as suggested by Llano and Ramirez. La gente, or foot soldiers, were the backbone of the Chicana movement. And so I think I wanted to focus on this idea of activism and leadership, because when we are interviewing folks of the Chicano movement era, there's a tendency, I think, to downplay their role or minimize their role. And I often tell my students, if you take when you're doing an interview at face value, right? Like, oh, well, never mind, she wasn't important, then you're dismissing all of that labor. And so I think that it's really important for us to bring attention to the work of mujeres in the movement, and also to really challenge our perceived notions of activism. And I think I'm going to end there.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Let me get Josie back on our screen. There you are. And I should be popping up as well in just a second. So one of the things as I'm figuring that out on my end of where I am, one of the things that I wanted to, first of all, thank you for sharing those, both of your stories, maestras, in terms of, like, especially, it's so obvious that there's a lot of love and corazón in these projects. And I think a lot of us watching today can really appreciate that and see that. And I think for me, the first question I wanted to ask y'all is, why these books? What was it that what called to you that this scholarship needed to be done? These books needed to be written. Dr. Marquez, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm from this region, and I went to school here at California State University, Sacramento. And my maestros, literally my teachers, my professors were Chicano movement elders. And they were of a retiring age when I came in the mid 90s. And I learned so much from them. They taught me so much. And I knew there was a history in Sacramento, and I began to read Chicano history, and I was really motivated because there was nothing written on Sacramento at the time. There was no history, no article, no book, no nothing on Mexicans in Sacramento. And so as an undergrad, I felt compelled to write this history. I felt like it was a missing link, and I like witnessed these social activists, and I felt like they needed their place in the Chicana historiography.
Dr. Méndez-Negrete?
You know, for me, it was making invisible the most obvious that my community had. People who were always invested and involved in creating better conditions and circumstances for the people and their children. In my experience, parents cared about education. In my experience, they were invested in their children becoming educated. In my experience, mothers and fathers worked whatever work was best available for them. And they were very proud of their background, and nowhere in any of the material that I read, and I can go back as early as The Children of Sanchez, which really is an anthropological study of a barrio in Mexico City. And that was presented as dysfunctional and equal to Mexican Americans in California and the Southwest. So for me, what had to be done was to make visible and to unearth the contributions that we have made all along before this nation became a nation and before the Spaniards colonized the region. Mexican people of Mexican descent, Chicanos, Chicanas, are people with a heart and with a complex structure of knowledge that they use, not for self-gain and not for self-promotion, but to improve their community. And I wanted to tell that story. I saw it all around me. I saw it all around me with, Blanca Alvarado. I saw it with Ernestina Garcia. I saw it with Sofia Mendoza. I saw it with Susie's mother, and I can't forget, I think it's Pacheco, Susie's mother, who made sure that every one of her 7 children went to tier 1 institutions to get their education. And nobody was writing about that. What was being written about was that we didn't do education, that we were too lazy and too dumb and too stupid to do that. So for me, it became a political agenda to get everybody told in their own words. For that reason, I wanted to introduce you to them and bring them to life. And I don't apologize for my emotions, but I'm still very moved by the fact that their voices are out. And Sofia Mendoza from the beginning told me, don't give me no pseudonym. I'm Sofia and they'll know who I am. Antonio Soto said, you have my permission to write anything you want to write about me. I don't want you to do it. And so what that did for me is begin to dispel some of the ideas that were objective, that were detached, that we need that kind of veil to be able to create knowledge. No, we have to place the heart in the work that we do and make it visible so that our humanity is evident and we don't continue to get derided and devaluated and unappreciated. So Pete Carrillo, if you're there, thank you for your story. Mitch, thank you for being my gopher, my comadre, and my supporter, making sure I got my photographs. so many of you there. Gabby, thank you for doing your San Jose tour with me so that we can get the last end of the book together. Debbie, when I saw your face, I cried because I remember Flor del Pueblo and your parents and the contributions that you made. There's so much that has to be written, and we have to do it.
When we were doing our check-in before we let everybody into the event, you know, we talked about that a bit, about how these community stories or community studies, local studies, that there needs to be more of this, this done, more of the scholarship, more of these books, more, I mean, what would you say out there to folks who are from other communities, other cities that haven't seen these kinds of stories told in print yet? And what can you say to encourage them or to encourage others for us to have more of this out there? Josie, do you want to go first?
Well, one of the things that I do is I use a pedagogical process called conocimientos, where I work with students to call back 3 to 4 generations of their family history so they can find out historically why they're here, and if when they weren't here, what their families might have done before them, what got them to be here, and how they're connected to the continent, not how they're connected to the Southwestern United States who still dismisses them. But you know, we look at the structures and the systemic inequalities that shape and frame who we are in relationship to the dominant. And they begin to fill in the gaps and the spaces in their stories. And they're able to reject the desconocimientos, or the no messages that we get filtered in with no vales, no eres buena, you're no good, you're not worthy. And we turn it around and we say yes. And there are gaps. And sometimes when we look back at our history, we have monsters. But we have to purge the monsters so that then we can work with ourselves and we can work with the rest of the people to empower people via our ability to create different ways of understanding ourselves. And so we have to, oops, somebody's calling me Chiona. They just call me a crybaby. So again, with the idea that if you look back 3 generations back, and then you understand how come your grandfather had to run out of Mexico. Was it during the Mexican Revolution? Was it political? And then you begin to see that there's nothing about being apolitical, that your very presence in this nation has to do with the politics of life. And so we gotta turn people on to loving history and to understanding that they are walking history. And when we keep secrets, and when we don't talk, and when we don't tell, and when we don't narrate the stories, we're complicit with domination. And so we need to tell our stories.
Wow. Lorena?
Yes. So I was saying before we went live is that I'm a big believer in community studies. And I think that they're very important. I know they're very, very difficult to get to. It was a lot of work to dig through archives just to piece together a history of Mexicans in Sacramento. And I would imagine that folks maybe in the Central Valley would struggle also. But it's such a worthwhile endeavor. I think that students are hungry to find themselves, to place themselves in history. And by doing local history, I think we empower them to do just that, because they can say, you know, this is my history, and they can begin to really, I think, just locate themselves in that history. So I do think it's worthwhile. I think that we still have many community studies to unearth. I think that we should encourage students to do even something small in terms of maybe their family history and start there. How is it that my family arrived in Lincoln, Nebraska? Was it part of a migration? I mean, you begin to ask these questions, I think, as an undergrad, and then you can begin to ask those questions and in sort of academia and then find your way back. But I agree with Josie. We all have stories to tell. We are walking history books in many ways, and we're all connected. And probably the way you are feeling, the way you're being treated has happened for a very long time. And so we need to be reminded of that.
I'd like to add, and only because I just saw his name, Donald Ellison was a doctoral student whom I had the honor of working with. And he's an ally. And his research focused on Mexican immigrant men. Nobody had interest in understanding their experiences with linguicism, for example, language oppression, the lack of health coverage, their sexual involvement and lack of protection, and HIV associated with it. And he did it because it was a humanist project to do. And he did it because he understood that nobody else was doing it, and that allies can work from the outside in without taking away the power that the people bring to the story, but telling the story in the words and in the experiences of the people that you interview without colonizing or usurping their words and making them other than what they mean to be. Thank you, Donald, for doing that. You better be doing the same thing in Washington, okay?
When y'all are talking about how folks organized, how folks did the work or got involved in the work, it's not hard for me to think about the work that has been going on the past, 10 years, especially in Arizona, where the University of Arizona Press is based, obviously, right? And I wonder sometimes, especially because of the work you've done in these books, is what do you think? Is there something missing in terms of like what we can learn from our history of organizing, our history of doing the work that maybe doesn't come across in the current organizing that's happening now? Josie, do you want to go next first?
I think what's missing is that we always impart knowledge from a correct place of doing it, or the right person, or the right way. And so when we operate from that point of departure, we fail to understand the strength and the contributions and the knowledge that people bring to organizing. One of those individuals who was part of my study, Dr. Jose Carrasco, he is an internationally renowned, sorry, Jose, but that's what I think, organizer who worked with some of the major organizers, Fred Ross, Alinsky, Ernie Cortez, etc. And nobody even knows that kind of effort he's done or that kind of work he's done. And, he needs to write the book if he's not going to tell us about it so we could write it. So we have to understand that not everybody does it the same way. And that, an example of that is dreamers and the undocumented students who took to the streets and challenged them with not being afraid, to take control of their lives and holding the power that be accountable for their humanity, for deriding it, because they claim their humanity by being active in doing their work. So there's multiple ways of knowing, multiple ways of doing, and activism and leadership are not top-down inherited qualities. They're generally actions for the common good and for the greater good of people, beginning with what you know, to make a difference and to create change.
Thank you. Lorena, before you answer the question, I was just gonna, you had talked about gender, when we first opened, and, issues around organizing and gender always seem to be a common, a common issue that comes up when we organized. And I was just gonna put that out there, and just in thinking of that a little bit about what you talked about. And but I still ask the same question, what can we learn today from what happened in the past, or is everyone on their own path, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, I think that my book brings attention to some of the internal conflicts of community and who is assigned the role of a leader and whose voice matters most. And I'm thinking here of my chapter on desegregation, where you have ethnic Mexican parents who are against the desegregation of Washington Elementary, which was deemed a Mexican school. And we had Mexican American leaders, people of position in the community, who said that they knew what was best for Chicanas and Chicanos and not to listen to these ethnic Mexican parents. And I think, like, if I just refer to that example, like what can we learn, right? Is that sometimes these so-called leaders are at odds with the community, and that we need to be better listeners, and we always need to understand what's happening on the ground and the needs of the community, or la gente, because those are the voices. Those are the folks that are the most impacted by policy, by measures that we take in education. And I think that case in particular really made me pause for a minute and ask myself, now that I am in a position of power as a professor, when I do talk about civil rights, or when I do talk about justice, to be very careful not to claim that I'm speaking on behalf of or for, but to really center their needs and their voices as much as possible, because we do tend to get removed the higher up we get, in terms of, getting these positions, into these positions. And even though we come from those communities, it doesn't always mean that you are the best to advocate, or, it's just, I think it's always good to check in and to check yourself as well.
One of the things I was telling people about the cover of my book, and I was telling them a story about the women they were not in the notion of la gente for you. The women were active, and they had a contestatory and challenging way of doing leadership. And so if you can think of playing, when you play, what do you call this game? You have
Like tic-tac-toe, or
tic-tac-toe, yeah. I don't know if you noticed, but Sofia, Ernestina, and Esther are the winning hand. Okay, and then Jack Prito, he was the man in the hill. Mike Garcia, first union president for SEIU, Anthony Soto, and then I included two partners, because it was a heterosexual group, and I wanted to make sure that they saw that men and women were there. But so the issues of gender were very much embedded in the interactions and the relationships, and they got in the way. They got in the way with the leadership, but also class was also an issue. The thing that was really fascinating to me is that they were able to unite around the central question, or what they were working on, even if they didn't agree with each other, and even if they didn't like each other. So, you know, it's really interesting to see the way that they understood use of self in a way to interact, to create change, and to make a difference. 187 was one of those points of unity in California.
Oh, right, right. One last question before we take questions from our audience. And if you have, I know we already have had some questions that have come in on chat. If folks want to get those questions in, we're going to be getting to that pretty soon. So you're welcome to post those now in chat. But one of the things I wanted to hear from you about too was, you know, these beautiful books. What do you hope comes from this next for you or for the communities? What do you hope is that next, is the next, you know, that happens next for from these books, from the publishing of your scholarship? Lorena, do you want to go first? Does that question make sense?
Can you repeat it? Just
Yeah, I mean, what do you hope happens next? Or what do you hope comes from the publishing of the scholarship?
well, first off, I hope that Sacramento's on the Chicano movement history map, since that was my mission as a young undergrad. I think the second thing would be that I hope that folks interrogate any social movement, even the one that we are in today, and to really seek the complexities and some of the lessons. I think there's still lessons to be learned. We cannot understand the Chicano movement as a triumphant story. In fact, we're in actually a worse position now than we were in the 1960s. And so there's still a lot of work to do in our communities. And I think we need to continue to honor the foot soldiers.
Josie?
I think these two books carve a path for other people to contest and challenge previously misinformed books that have been written and miswritten about the people. And I can tell you, San Jose is so active and there's so much going on in that community that 10 books can be produced if Arizona University of Arizona Press was willing to publish them. Okay, but the options are there, the possibilities are there, and we need to tell our stories. We need to write. You know, San Jose was really the first place that had Chicano studies in the nation. What gets promoted is Northern San Fernando and, you know, the LA area, but San Jose stays in the background. The first Chicano walkout students happened in San Jose, led by Sofia Mendoza and Jose Carrasco. Okay, and that was from a middle school, Roosevelt. And nobody knows that. Okay, the Cinco de Mayo is connected to San Jose and it's connected to that region. It was during the time of the Mexico War with France. And it was, you know, similar to the Fiestas Patriotas Mexicanas, you know, it's connected to San Jose. But if we don't know and we don't do the research, no other people are going to know that that is the case. So LA, you're not the only one.
I love that. I love that. I'm going to try and start from where I see questions began, and hopefully I'm not going to miss anyone. Call me out if I do, folks. I can take it.
Can we see the person whose question you're asking? Can we see their face?
We can try. It might be a little difficult. Let's see if I can do that.
Because I can see a lineup here and I can see various people.
Okay, so this one is from Martha Jaques. Martha, I asked if you could share your video. You're welcome to do that. And it says, her question is, how can we introduce these stories to our children, especially given that we now have many Spanish, English, bilingual schools? These are the local heroes of their communities. Who would like to go first to answer Martha's question?
I think one of the ways is by bringing in children's literature, that already begin to talk about that, works by Carmen Tafoya, with Emma Tenayuca, for example. There's a multiplicity of books that speak about, those people that have previously been made invisible. And so telling stories, Cesar Chavez is another one, Dolores Huerta, and teaching them the presence of people that have made contributions to our society. That would be one good beginning. But what's really sad is that oftentimes the teachers aren't prepared to do that, or they don't have the resources necessary.
Lorena?
Yeah, I think we're in a completely different ball field than we were, 20 years ago or 30 or whatever, when we were in grammar school. In fact, my daughter just recently did a book report. She was in 2nd grade on Selena. She's a huge fan, and I was able to find a kid's book, a chapter book on Selena. And so there is research out there, and I think that we can begin to bring those into the school curriculum. So, November is right around the corner. Let's do Dia de los Muertos. Now we have that movie Coco. I even have my students in college watch that film. And so there's ways for them to sort of connect, see themselves. I think it's very important for them to see other folks that look like them. Their brown skin is really important for me. My daughter's, a dark-skinned Mexican, so I don't want her to ever feel the things that I was meant to feel when I was in grammar school.
That's where Prietita comes in, Gloria Anzaldua's book. Children's.
Yeah, but those are ways in which we can help empower these young children, and eventually they're going to understand the bigger history, and they can pick up maybe a book like mine. But I don't see that my kids are going to pick up this book like tomorrow, right? So just starting small and looking at those leaders, as Josie mentioned. There's a lot of stuff on Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, and there's films, there's kids' books. So there's a lot out there right now, I think. We still need more, though.
Thank you, Martha. Okay, so Gloria has a question, and I am going to ask Gloria if she would like to join us. Oops. Nope. Where are you, Gloria? There you are. So the question is, thank you both for doing such important work and for ensuring these stories will be available for future generations. As you think about the efforts of their respective actions, what do you understand are their legacies and gains with respect to the Mexican community? Who would like to go first? Lorena, would you like to go first on that?
I missed the question a little bit there.
As you think about their efforts of generations of people that you both have highlighted in this book, you think about their respective actions. What do you understand are their legacies and gains with respect to the Mexican community? Not sure if
that's such a good question. It's hard to answer.
Yeah.
I think they've definitely left an imprint in Sacramento. I mean, like almost physically, if you go downtown or there's like Southside Park, you have murals by this generation. you know, one of the folks that I interviewed, for instance, was my professor at Sac State. And that's when I took my first La Mujer Chicana class. I mean, she opened my eyes. And so it's like, in doing the work that they do, they have left, they've been role models and encouraged us and supported us and taught us the way in the best way that they knew how. And I'm recording just not every story, but I'm recording some stories. And I hope, my goal was just to make it more complex, or a more complex understanding of the Chicano movement. And while I am a fan of this era, I also know that there was shortcomings and for us to all learn. And so I almost want to say that their legacy lives in me, as they motivated me to write this book.
Josie?
I think, read the book and you'll see all of the amazing contributions they made. But the other thing too is that there are other people who have made amazing contributions. For example, I was telling you that I got really excited to see Debbie's face on the display initially. Her family was associated with the foundation of a Baptist church in East San Jose that created some amazing activists, musicians, actors, creators. Why hasn't anybody written that book? And so what it does, it points us to the gaps and what we consider important. Hey, Deborah Rodriguez. Okay, so it's like those stories have to be told, but at the same time, we have to remind each other that Jack Prito and Jose Villa, among others, they were not the only ones. Ernestina Garcia, Sofia Mendoza, and so many more kicked butt when it came to taking on the police department and getting a new chief of police that understood or tried to understand the Mexican-American community at a time when that wasn't being done, which resulted in us having the first Chicano chief of police, in the city of San Jose back in the day. Where B. Mendoza was the first person to ever create a domestic violence program where bilingual services were the epitome of their image, where she took on Gloria Steinem, I don't think it was Steinem, it was Absug, who she took on at an international conference to call them out for their classism and their linguicism. All the stories need to be told because we have the power to talk about what needs to be memorialized and remembered. Kathy Chavez Napoli, who just came in, I saw her name. She took on the mayor of the city because he was memorializing himself with a fake hero, with a Fallon statue, for example. And there's so many more things. And then there's Sofia Mendoza in, health, a health clinic at the east side of San Jose, because of the work of Ernestina and the work of Sofia Mendoza. Now, some people argue that they didn't get along and they didn't see things the same way. That might have been the case, but that clinic got built. Okay. So there's more. So read the book.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you.
This is a question from Denise Frausto. As I look at starting my master's degree, what advice can you give me? Whose voice do I need to be, especially now considering what this country is going through? I don't feel like I know what I'm doing, so your advice is gold. I think Lorena answered saying center their stories in her response.
I think one of the things for me is that,
there's Denise.
Hi, Denise. For me is that I think adultism is rampant, okay? The idea that because you're older and you've lived longer, you know more than people who are younger than you. I think that that is something that we have to deal with and contend with. You know, age does not necessarily gives us wisdom. I know some people who are close to 100 who are the dumbest people I know. And I know 10-year-olds who are brilliant, who are wise. So we just have to be more open-minded and understand that there's alternative ways of doing things. And sometimes the youth have the idea, but what the youth also have to do is that they don't have all the answers. And they need to look at the way others have done it before them, so they can contrast and compare the possibilities of the ways you go about doing change. Sorry, you probably heard something I've already said somewhere along the way, Denise.
Lorena, do you want to add anything to for advice for Denise on her master?
Yeah, I'm actually really happy to hear that you're concerned about this. That means that you're on the right track. And I think one of the most empowering things is to let the research speak for itself. Sometimes we go into research and we think we're going to be telling this story, and then the story takes a different turn. And if you pay attention to those voices, I think that you will be able to justly tell their stories, and always to see yourself as a partner in scholarship, and to try to like break down those power barriers. Even though we are in a position of power, we're the ones telling their stories, to focus them as much as possible. And that takes time and skill, but the more you read, maybe there's a scholar that you're like, this person got it right on, and you try to mimic their writing. I mean, nobody teaches us to do this, especially in grad school. Like, how do you give power to marginalized communities? And, you know, we don't know how to do that, but there are really, really good examples. And for me, one of them was Robin Kelly, and he's a historian in African-American history. And so I really leaned on his writings. I returned to his books when I was working on my book, and I was like, this is where the ideas started coming. And you will have so many great examples because we have amazing scholars now in the field. But just trust yourself. Just, I know you got this, and you'll do great.
Denise, thanks for your questions. Much appreciated. The next one, I think, you know, you both have talked about this, and as we were talking, but someone was talking about to what extent is class analysis part of these two books by Josie and Lorena. Josie, do you want to take that on first? I know both of you have talked about class a bit during, but maybe expand on it a little bit.
I think that the people who participated in the study I wrote were really class conscious. They understood their location as working class people, and also understood the differentiation that was created to keep them in the worst job and the lowest paying job. And they wanted to contest and challenge that. I think that's why they were active in pro-worker endeavors. So I think that there was also class consciousness around how people were in relationship to each other, and how a little bit of entitlement might separated or split up people according to the direction of their actions or their activism or their leadership. And there was that sense of awareness, that sense of not allowing themselves to be entitled or getting called out when that happened. But I think that probably the most difficult part of it was not necessarily class, but gender, around what women can do as compared what men can do, and who has a right to lead and who can be an activist leader and who isn't. So it's, you know, they're really nuanced structures of inequality that get danced on depending on what's going on or what the struggle is that's being taken. For example, on the district elections in the city of San Jose, everybody united for it. And so it was great to see that class was secondary and that what was primary was opening up the participatory process of voting to all communities, not just people who could buy the election because they were at large elections. So, and all those things are intertwined with race, class, gender, racialized ethnicity, and even sexuality. And in one case, I think, the case of Delia Alvarez, who ended up losing her position as director of the health department for the county of Santa Clara, that was outright, homophobia. And, and it was men and women, but it was a white woman who pushed her out and went after her. So all that stuff shows up in there in the different nuanced relationships and interactions that we witness.
Lorena, how would you talk about class being addressed in your work, this book?
Yeah, so class is central. La Gente is the working poor, the working class. And so it's one of the major analyses that I bring in my book. And I do have a chapter on cannery workers and the formation of a cannery workers union by Mexican Americans in the 1960s and early 1970s. So I really try to bring them to the forefront in terms of their voices and the major issues and how they confronted racism and sexism on the cannery floor.
I think you just allowed me to inch in to the discussion, Lorena. Dr. Marquez, thank you very much. I think one person that could be left behind unless I share it with you is Patricia Sabea was my dissertation advisor. Nobody believed that Chicano studies was an area of study that should be done in those particular days. We didn't study ourselves. Others studied us and we could go someplace else, but not study ourselves. And with her support and that she believed in me and that was a viable project, that was the first step. And then John Brown Childs, who actually gave me the notion of relational leadership, was also part of it. And so I think that there are people along the way that have carved the path for us to pursue our work. And I want to thank Patricia because she also made it feasible for me to see that that I could study San Jose because she had studied the cannery workers and their relationship to the men in the community, with cannery workers' lives. And so there's so many ways that we create paths. And all of you, go for it. That's just what I'd say. Thank you, Patricia.
I just put in chat a link to our website if people are interested in purchasing our books or these books, your books, these wonderful books. And
isn't there a discount right now that we can talk about?
I believe there is. Is it
35% or 40%?
40%. Yeah, I will be, there we go. Savannah, you're beautiful. Savannah in the chat has put in the code AZ Community 20 for 35% off. Thank you, Savannah.
And if you bought one already, don't return it. Get another one for somebody else.
There you go. I love it. Yeah, exactly. First, I just want to thank you both again, Dr. Marquez, Dr. Méndez-Negrete, for your time today and sharing so much with us from everyone at the press. We really mean it. We really thank you for your generous time today. Is there anything, we have 5 minutes, anything any of you would like to add before we say goodbye to everyone?
Well, I'm very honored to share the stage with Josie. And I do owe a lot to the Chicana scholars, the historians who paved the way for me. They are my role models. So thank you so much. I also am very grateful to the press. And this is my first book. And I really had no idea the process, but I will say that Kristen Buckles was just amazing. She was excited for my project. And I've heard horror stories, and the University of Arizona Press like treated me so well the whole way through. And so I'm very appreciative as a first-time author. And I'm really happy to see the book out. It's actually 20 years in the making. I'm just overjoyed. I just feel so much happiness at this moment in my life. And I'm trying to hold on to it because I know I'm going to get jaded along the way. But right now, it's just a dream come true. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, thank you for allowing us to be part of your scholarship and to publish these books. They're beautiful books, and we appreciate you actually, and appreciate the important work that you do for all of us and for our communities as well. Thank you for your time, y'all. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. And we'll send out a message to everyone who registered with a recording of our event today and conversation and more information about the books. And I wish you all lots of good health. And thanks again for taking time to be with us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this.
You're so welcome. Besos and abrazos.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye. Thank you. Bye, everybody.